Hey guys, welcome to the RotoPros pre-lock show for Monday night. It's a bit of a later start than usual today because I've been looking at some weather reports here, and weather is definitely a concern for tonight. With the pitching choices, I don't think there's too much to talk about in terms of weather. The games that have the highest chances of rain, I think, are the games that would be more of the offensive targets. So for pitching, we can kind of ignore the weather. And I think the pitching choices are actually pretty obvious tonight. So on the high end, we have Patrick Corbin and Carlos Carrasco. Corbin has definitely been better than Carrasco overall this year, but there are some very troubling velocity concerns for Corbin recently. And I think that even without that, Carrasco just has so much easier of a matchup that he would be my favorite pick anyway. Carrasco is pitching in a better pitcher's park than Corbin. It should be roof open in Arizona tonight. I think they've already officially announced that. But Detroit is a decent pitcher's park, and the Tigers are missing basically all of their starting lineup tonight. So Victor Martinez is in there, and that is pretty much it. So we don't have Nick Castellanos. We don't have Miguel Cabrera. He's still on the DL. Jeimer Candelario is out. Leonis Martin is out. So Carrasco is facing a lineup of 7 righties and 2 switch hitters. And almost all of these hitters are really bad. I think Martinez is really the only one that's any good. We have Mikey Mata, Pete Kozma is batting second, James McCann and John Hicks are hitting 4th and 5th. Both of them are catchers. And then Jacoby Jones, Nico Goodrum, Jose Iglesias, Dixon Machado. I think this is the worst lineup that any team has rolled out in any game this season. Carrasco is going to have ownership, but he is one of the best pitchers in baseball. I think he's kind of like a second-tier ace, where maybe he's in the 10 to 20 range of best starting pitchers. He's better in away games, and this is a pitcher's park against an awful lineup. So, I think you're going to see Carrasco at 40% ownership or something like that at lower stakes, maybe 30 to 40. I think he could be in the 40s, though. At higher stakes, Carrasco is going to be like 70+% owned, I think. So at lower stakes, it's much more justifiable to kind of eat the chalk on Carrasco. I think he's so obviously the best play on the slate that unless he were something like 80% owned, I don't think you have to worry about fading him. I do think you could choose to not use him in every lineup. I don't think he's a must all-in play because he is expensive, and there is an opportunity cost there of paying his salary and not going cheaper a pitcher, and then being a little bit strapped for cash on offense. So I'm not saying all in Carrasco, but I think without a doubt he should be everyone's highest owned pitcher tonight. So he's going to be my highest owned pitcher. I don't think I'll have him in every single lineup, but I think he is the guy to have the most of, maybe like 80 to 90%, something like that. Carrasco is definitely the best play on the high end. So the rest of the pitchers, there are a few guys here that are interesting. The game that looks the best for pitching tonight overall is definitely the Rockies-Padres game. It actually has a 6.5 total on a night where no other game is less than an 8 total. Both of these offenses are bad. The Rockies even have been bad at Coors Field this season, but they're certainly bad away from Coors. The Padres offense is always bad. They're still missing Will Myers. They're still missing Hunter Renfroe. So their numbers against lefties are actually worse than they might seem on the surface, and they're already pretty bad. The Padres strike out 26% of the time versus lefties. Rockies are about 26% of the time also. Both teams are a little bit better against lefties than they are against righties in terms of WRC+, but the Padres are missing more of their guys. So in terms of picking between Tyler Anderson and Joey Lucchesi, I think Anderson is the better play for me because he has an easier matchup, even though he's on the road. I think these are really comparable pitchers. Anderson is a little bit more high variance. I think he's shown some proneness to walk guys quite a bit this year. He's averaging over 5 walks per 9 on the road. But I think the lack of offense in the Padres lineup, and we don't have the full lineup yet, but they are missing 2 of their better right-handed hitters in Myers and Renfroe. So the numbers for the Padres against lefties, I think, are a bit inflated. And because of that, and also because Anderson's a little bit cheaper than Lucchesi, Anderson is my second favorite pitcher, and Lucchesi is third. But both are good plays. Like I think both make sense to have about 50%, maybe Anderson 50, Lucchesi 40, something like that. But both are definitely good targets. I think both could have some ownership, but I think it'll be a little diluted because there are enough decent choices that I think people will go to. I think some people will use Patrick Corbin. There are a lot of pitchers that have either pitched well this year or just have good reputations or whatever. I think pitching ownership could be spread out a little bit beyond Carrasco. So I don't have any ownership concerns on Tyler Anderson and Joey Lucchesi, and I just kind of prefer Anderson for the matchup and for the price. But Lucchesi's fine too. I think there's a little bit of an interesting dilemma for someone else, though, being maybe the number 3 pitcher ahead of Lucchesi, and we kind of need to see a lineup for it. So Andrew Heaney has been really good this year, and he's substantially cheaper than Lucchesi and Anderson. The problem is that he's facing the Astros. So the Astros may be playing without George Springer tonight. That is the move that would, I think, impact Heaney and kind of put him over the top for me above Joey Lucchesi. Let's see. I think Springer is probably going to play, though. They had said over the weekend that he should be back for this series against the Angels. I think the Astros probably care less about the matchup against Texas and right the team that they're competing with for their division. Have the Angels put out an official lineup yet? It looks like, the Astros, it looks like they have not, but I'm going to assume that Springer is playing just based on what they were saying about him over the weekend. So Heaney, I think, is a solid number 4 option. I would have him 10, 20, maybe a little bit more than that percent. But I think he's just kind of an okay play because of how cheap he is and how good he is, even in a tough matchup. He does have the benefit of home field advantage, and even though he's facing a really good offense, it's still cheap enough given how well he's pitched that I think it's probably worth it. And for what it's worth, sharp money has actually favored the Angels quite a bit here. Let's see what the line movement looks like. So the Angels have dropped from plus 115 to plus 110. The over-under is actually trending down towards 7.5. So this would be the only game besides that San Diego game that has an over-under of less than 8. I think this one will reach 7.5 before game time, despite the fact that the public is kind of betting the over here. So Heaney's numbers for the year, he has a 4.78 ERA, but he's striking out almost 10 batters per 9 innings. He has a 3.45 FIP, 3.34 xFIP. His swinging strike percentage is 11%, which is actually down a bit from last year. But he struck out 11.2 batters per 9 innings last year. It was also only a 5-inning sample. A 5-start sample. So I think, I don't know. There's some consideration for last year's numbers, but Heaney, I think, should strike out less guys than what he's been doing so far. But he still is probably a decent strikeout pitcher. And just kind of trusting the sharp money here too. I think there is some merit to using Heaney. But unless Springer's out, I still think Joey Lucchesi is a better play than Andrew Heaney. The other pitcher that I'd like a little bit, and I guess I'll save him because it's going to kind of tie into offense here. So I'll mention one other guy first that I don't really like, and that's Chris Stratton against the Reds. It's a pitcher's park for Stratton, but the Reds' offense has gotten healthy recently. And they've actually been a lot better. They just swept the Dodgers on the road, and they scored a decent amount of runs in most of those games. Stratton for the year is striking out 8.4 batters per 9 innings, but he's been very walk-prone. And his swinging strike percentage is only at 8.2%. So I'm not sure how much of a strikeout pitcher Chris Stratton is. And even though he's cheap, I just think he's kind of like, I don't know, he's safe probably to come close to hitting value. I think he should probably be around hitting value. Maybe, I don't know, maybe he's one of the better bets to hit value. I just think he has so little upside that I don't really have much interest in him. I don't think we're going to need that degree of salary savings. I think the same could be said for Junior Guerra, who I think is kind of similar to Chris Stratton in a similar quality matchup. Stratton does have the park advantage over Guerra. So I don't know, if you're going for a really cheap pitcher, the best bet and safest bet probably is Stratton. But I think he's too fringy of a play with too little upside that I don't really have interest there at all. The pitcher that I definitely think will be extremely contrarian and could be worth using is Mike Fiers. And this is purely for ownership because I'm 99.9% sure that the Indians are going to be the highest owned offense tonight, and it'll probably be by a decent amount. So using Fiers is purely a leverage play. I would say doing this in one of 20 lineups maybe makes sense. Like, he's going to be less than 5% owned. Fiers was struggling earlier in the year, but his velocity has actually ticked back up a decent amount to 89 miles per hour, which for him is kind of normal. There were a couple starts there where he was throwing in the 86 to 87 range. So his velocity has come back a little bit. But Fiers is also really, really cheap, so I think there's some safety there. So basically, the bottom line is if I'm going all the way down to a really cheap pitcher, I think Fiers makes more sense than Stratton because I think there's more tournament upside for it because the Indians are going to have a lot of ownership. So that would be the reason to take Fiers over Stratton. In a vacuum, I think it's close. I probably wouldn't use either if ownership weren't in consideration here, but because of the leverage and because of the Indians, probably, I don't know, 25, 30, something like that % ownership. I think Lindor could even be above 40%. I think because of that, there's enough leverage to consider Fiers. But I think the core for pitching should still be Carrasco, Anderson, Lucchesi, and then I think you could throw some darts at Heaney and Fiers. But really those first three guys, and especially Carrasco and Tyler Anderson, I think those are clearly the best plays tonight. All right, offense. Let's see if we've got a couple more lineups here. And the weather. Have to get to the weather because it is making offense a little bit annoying to figure out. I do think the weather will end up being fine for all of the games tonight. Part of the reason that I didn't mention pitching in either of these games, the Twins game and the Royals game, is because I think all four pitchers are bad. But the chance of in-game delays here makes it pretty much impossible to comfortably roster a starting pitcher from either game. Not that I really would ever want to roster Jake Odorizzi, Wade LeBlanc, Ryan Yarbrough, and Eric Skoglund outside of the easiest possible matchups in perfect situations. And these are not ideal situations for any of those guys. But these games, I think, are okay for offense. I think it's good enough spots for, well, not all four of them necessarily, but for the Mariners and for the Royals especially, that the weather risk is – I think the weather risk is low enough and the upside of the offenses is high enough that it's worth taking chances here. I think we should see some sort of delay, whether the game's starting a delay or it's a mid-game delay in both. But specifically in Minnesota, it looks like the rain should let up around, I guess, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central Time. So there's plenty of time left the rest of the night to finish the game. And it's good hitting conditions. It should be humid there. I think it's warmer in Kansas City, but wind blowing out a little bit in both of these games. And the Mariners are just underpriced against Jake Odorizzi, who has an ERA below 4, but his FIP and XFIP are in the 5s. The Mariners are without Robinson Cano tonight, but Odorizzi is actually better against lefties, so Cano's absence matters less in this matchup than it would probably against another comparably bad right-handed pitcher. It's kind of like Odorizzi is a lefty that's pitching tonight. So for Segura, for Mitch Haniger, for Nelson Cruz, all being priced around 4K, I think it's a really good spot for those guys. Mariner stacks in general, everyone's kind of priced around 4K. So I think it's a cheap enough stack in a really good matchup against a bad starting pitcher who gives up a lot of home runs that I'm okay with a little bit of weather risk here. And I think it is a small amount of risk. So I'm not really worried about Seattle not getting the game in at some point tonight. I think there could be a delay, but I'm still fine with it. Obviously, we still have an hour and a half until lock right now, so there could be it could change. The weather could move. But I think we're looking at kind of just like on and off rain, and they end up finishing the game because the rain isn't supposed to be too heavy anyway. The rain in Kansas City looks more intense, but I think there's less of it. So I think that game is much more likely to have like an hour delay in the early innings and then just resume after without a problem. It's definitely warm in Kansas City with temperatures in the 80s right now, high 70s for game time, wind blowing out, and a bad pitching matchup between Ryan Yarbrough and Eric Skoglund. The reason I'm targeting against Yarbrough more, well, the Royals offense I think is better than the Rays offense, at least at the top for stacking purposes. But Yarbrough, even though his numbers look kind of decent this year, he only has a 7.1% swinging strike rate, and he's also done a lot of what he's done out of the bullpen, and it's just easier to pitch out of the bullpen. It also kind of looks like the Rays aren't going with bullpen games when Yarbrough starts anymore. They let him throw a full 5 innings last start with, I think it was 80 pitches or so. So he actually should be staying in the game for longer, which is better for the Royals offense. Lucas Duda, I think, is going on the disabled list. Either way, he's out of the lineup tonight, but he's left-handed, so I don't really think that matters much for stacking against a left-handed pitcher. Whit Merrifield has been a lot better against lefties this year. So the Royals stack that I would want to target, maybe I'd leave off John Jay and most of them and go with Chesler Cuthbert, who's better against lefties too. And then you can play Merrifield, Soler, Moustakas, Perez, and Cuthbert together. Cuthbert is a third baseman, though, so let me make sure the positions work there, because it would be annoying if Moustakas and Cuthbert are both third basemen and you can't play them together. Okay, Cuthbert actually has first base eligibility. I'll unstack those Royals. John Jay is only 2,900, so I don't think he's the worst play. But 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, I think, would be my preferred route for stacking the Royals. For the Mariners, I think it's 1 through 5, but I think Healy, Zunino, and Gamble are fine to use. Gordon Beckham is not a good hitter, but he is 2,600, so I guess he's okay. But as a punt play, I definitely prefer Ben Gamble. So the Royals and Mariners are two of my favorite offenses. I think most people definitely will be on the Indians, but I'm going to have them much less than these two teams, partly for ownership, but also it's a more difficult park in Detroit than these other places. So Detroit and Kansas City are generally fairly comparable in terms of being pitchers' parks, but it's going to be hot in Kansas City with the wind blowing out. In Detroit tonight, the wind is blowing in a bit, and the Indians are also just more expensive than these other teams. We have Lindor at 5,300. We have Jose Ramirez at 5,000. We have Edwin at 4,500. The Indians are priced up because they've been quote-unquote hot lately. They've been really good. They just dominated the Royals. I think they were the winning stack in every day of that series. But even without considering ownership, I think given their prices, the Royals and Mariners are in better spots. So those are my two favorite offenses, not the Indians. I think you can roster the Indians. I think they're fine against Mike Fiers, but you're dealing with high ownership. You're dealing with high pricing. So I really don't think it's a great spot for Cleveland. I think the same can kind of be said about the Red Sox, who are in a game with an over-under of 10 at home against the A's. The over-under has gone up because I think of the weather. The wind is blowing out to left center in Boston tonight. Sean Manaea has definitely overachieved a bit this year, and I think the betting line movement just kind of shows that he's definitely been a bit overrated and should regress a little bit just because he's not going to throw a no-hitter every game. But his peripherals do have him as kind of a borderline number 2, maybe number 3 starter, where his FIP is 353, xFIP 372, but he was worse than that last year, and his swinging strike percentage actually hasn't gone up. He's been between 11 and 12% his whole career. So I think Manaea is a good pitcher, but it is a road game against a tough offense, and I think the Red Sox should do fine against him also. But the Red Sox are even more expensive than the Indians, and that's going to be the problem here too, especially if you want to roster Carlos Carrasco. If I had to pick between the Indians and Red Sox, I do prefer Boston for the ownership. I think the expected output might be higher, but I don't really like either of these offenses. I'd actually probably rather use the A's offense for the hitting conditions against Rick Porcello. I don't like the Red Sox offense that much because of how much they cost. So the Red Sox and Indians, I think, are fringe plays. I think you can fade them. I think the focus should be on the Royals and the Mariners. Those are my two favorite offenses tonight. And then we have two contrarian offenses that I think make a lot of sense for a couple different reasons. I'm just going to do a quick time check here. Got 5:40. Okay. Still got plenty of time before lock, but this will probably only take a few more minutes. Just got to mention these two contrarian spots that I think do have a lot of merit. So I'll kind of just recap where we are so far before getting into those. For pitching, I like Carrasco the most against this really weak Tigers lineup. And then I think Tyler Anderson, Joey Lucchesi are number 2 and 3 in that order. I think that's a pretty good pitching core to stick with just those 3 guys. I think you can go Andrew Heaney or Mike Fiers for contrarian value. For offense, Royals and Mariners, highest expected outputs, I think relative to price at least. Those are the best values. And then I think the Indians and Red Sox should score plenty of runs tonight, but the pricing is a little high, and I think the ownership will be a little high. So I don't have much interest in either of those. For contrarian offense, we have 2 spots. So there's no – I'm kind of stalling here because I'm hoping we'll get a lineup for one or both of these teams. We don't have one for either yet. But I'll just kind of talk about this anyway, even without the benefit of knowing the batting orders. So the Brewers are facing Patrick Corbin, who has been really, really good this year. But in his last couple starts, his velocity has been way down. Here, I'll just respond to this comment on YouTube. I think if you're gonna use cheaper pitching so that you can pay up for offense, I think Anderson and Lucchesi are the better bets than Anderson and Stratton, just because Lucchesi is so much better than Stratton and he is an easier matchup. Even with San Diego being less of a pitcher's park than San Francisco, the rest of the circumstances for Lucchesi, I think, are more than enough to offset the price difference between those two guys. But anyway, Patrick Corbin was throwing 92 or 93 through his first few starts of the year. And in the last 2 starts, he has seen his fastball velocity drop below 90. He was actually around 87 in the final inning of his last start against the Dodgers. So I think there's a decent chance that Corbin is pitching hurt right now. His swinging strike percentage has dropped from, it was 15 or 16% through his first 4 or 5 starts. It's been around 10% the last 3. So I think best case scenario for Corbin right now is that he's dealing with a mechanical issue that is lowering his velocity, and at least temporarily, he's just going to be kind of mediocre. But I think that's his best case scenario. I guess there's a chance his velocity just comes all the way back and he goes back to being great like he was at the beginning of this year. I just think that's a very, very small possibility. So the best case, reasonably likely scenario for Corbin is that he just kind of continues to pitch as a mediocre pitcher for a little while longer before he figures things out. But worst case scenario for Corbin is that he seriously is injured and the velocity continues to drop and he ultimately ends up on the DL. And if that's the scenario, then there's a ton of merit to stacking against him because we may be catching Corbin on his way down before people kind of realize that he's nowhere close to the pitcher that he was the first month of the season. Corbin has had plenty of injury concerns in the past. He really, really heavily relies on his slider, which probably is not good for his throwing elbow. And in recent starts, he's actually had to throw his fastball more because he hasn't been able to locate the slider as well. So maybe there's an injury here. It is a hitter's park tonight in Arizona with the roof open. It's kind of always at least a little bit of a hitter's park, depending on how you feel about the humidor. But the Brewers are priced way down to face him, and we'll need to see a lineup here. We still don't have a lineup. But there are enough righties here that I think this is actually a really good stack with Kane, Braun, Aguilar, Domingo Santana, Hernan Perez. They're all in the 3,000 to 4,000 range. Christian Yelich is the one lefty who probably will play. He's priced below 4,000. So I think the Brewers make for a really good contrarian stack because no one's going to do it. I don't think there's that much leverage against Corbin because I don't think he'll have a ton of ownership. But you're certainly getting the Brewers at low ownership. I think that will be a very unpopular pick tonight. So if there's something wrong with Corbin, it's really hard to know what's going on. I think it's even impossible to know what's going on with him. But on the chance that he is pitching hurt and continues to get worse, there's a lot of upside for Milwaukee. So I think that stack is worth having at least a little bit. The other contrarian stack I like is the Angels, and I think this is purely just because no one's going to do it. Lance McCullers is always worse on the road, and the Angels, outside of Mike Trout, are priced down. Trout is still 5,700, so, that's way too expensive for him, but it's still Mike Trout, and if McCullers has a bad game, maybe Trout just faces some bad relievers. So Trout is certainly not someone I would use as a plug, but for stacks, I think he's fine. And the rest of the Angels are priced down. So we'll kind of have to see what the lineup looks like there. But this is purely for ownership. I think McCullers on the road is worrisome enough. He got destroyed by the Twins on the road a few starts ago, just if you need a data point of him having the capacity to do poorly at all, because McCullers is generally very good. But I prefer the Brewers as a contrarian stack to the Angels. It's just that I think the Angels are a good enough offense that any chance to get them at 1 or 2 or 3% ownership is worth taking. So I don't know. I would maybe make one Angel stack out of 20 lineups. But I think more for the Brewers. I think even like 3, 4, or 5 Brewer stacks makes sense. And the Angels are just more of a dart throw for a team that's going to be really low owned. And they are good enough that they could have a huge game against anybody. So, yeah, the weather does look bad in Minnesota and in Kansas City, and there's certainly risk there. But I really don't think we're looking at anything more than a delay for either of these games. I think I absolutely would not use starting pitchers in these games, even if there were good starting pitchers to choose from, which there aren't. But if you just look at the weather forecast for each game, it clears up later in the night in both places. So I don't have much concern here. And I think the spots are good enough for Seattle and Kansas City that the risk is worth taking. If you're not using the Indians and the Indians have a huge game, then it kind of doesn't matter what you did anyway with your picks. And I just don't think there's enough value on the Indians to play that game tonight. So if you're not going to use the Indians, you really do need to use these other good spots. And I think the Mariners and Royals are without a doubt the best bets for their prices. So I'm fine with the weather risk. I wouldn't use them too much as plugs because of the weather risk, but I think for stacking, they are safe enough. Like I think there's only maybe a 10% chance of each game getting rained out. And I think that's good enough where it's going to be fine, and just considering the probability, I think it's worth taking the shot. So that's going to do it for today. It looks like we don't have any more questions. Well, we actually have a couple more. Let's see. Yeah, I think the A's will definitely have low ownership tonight. Rick Porcello has been good this year, so I'm not sure about the expected output. I don't think Porcello – well, part of why I want to target low ownership is when it's leverage against a pitcher that has ownership. So like Patrick Corbin isn't going to be super chalky tonight, but I think he could be 20 or 30 or something like that % owned, maybe even a little higher. And because of that, if the Brewers do well, Corbin does less well. Stacking against Porcello, I don't think will have the same benefit because I think most people just aren't paying $10,500 for Rick Porcello. So there's not the same benefit of getting the leverage against Porcello. Having said that, though, the A's are a good enough offense and can be had at low enough ownership with reasonable enough prices that, yeah, they're probably worth using. But I think the Brewers make for a better contrarian play. One, because I think Corbin might be hurt, but also because I think Corbin will have a lot more ownership than Porcello will have. Hope that covers it. But yeah, I think the A's are viable. I just prefer other contrarian spots. So that's going to do it for this podcast, for this YouTube show. Should be back. I don't think I'll have one tomorrow, actually, on the road tomorrow. But Wednesday I'll be back with another one of these. So good luck tonight and see you then.